How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, I've got some recent requests. We should cover stuff that relates to police, again, within the family of law enforcement. And they wanted to ask my panel an opinion on what we think about social workers working next to our police officers. So this was a dialogue that really took us a while to try to get an argument, like really put ourselves in the position of both the police officer as well as the social worker who's going to have to be called on scene. And I think we have a very good discussion that is really meant to not give a perspective of what we believe is right, but just make us think, make us think from objectively from the people that are going to have to work together. So I got two great people to share this dialogue with me. We're going to have Connie Alleyne, and we're also going to have Cody Cook. So Connie, do you mind introducing yourself, this author now, to our audience? And Connie, please remember the name of your book. It's not the podcast.
Hi, everyone. It's Connie Alleyne. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I am also the podcast host of The Fly Behind the Wall. And now I am an author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon. So I come to you guys with almost 2 decades of correctional experience. And I was actually very excited about this conversation just because in the context of, police reform, I think certainly it opens us all up to thinking about, are there other ways that we could be more effective as we're engaging in the community? So I look forward to certainly this dialogue with Cody and with Tony.
Yeah, Tony.
Well, what's your name?
No, I don't care. I just listen. I was getting ready to introduce Cody, and I said, "Wait a second, let me pull back. Where did Tony come from?" All right, hey, I'll take it. And guys, even though sometimes we venture off, sometimes it's fun for us to break away and just have another discussion to get it. And then obviously we go right back into what our heart and soul belongs to, which is corrections. But I think this kind of touches on, because you never know what happens in the street could eventually happen in the prison system. And Cody, long time no see. How have you been? And can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me back on the show. My name is Cody Ann Cook. I'm a retired police officer. I worked off and on for 25 years. I have worked in a variety of different positions in law enforcement, including undercover narcotics, road patrol, working in a courthouse, working navigational patrol, and also doing federal prisoner transports, which exposed me to the correction side. I continued on and got my bachelor's in psychology and was considering going on to get my master's in social work to do counseling with law enforcement and military that have PTSD. And I, of course, include corrections in the terminology of law enforcement. To me, you are my brothers and sisters and do, in fact, a harder position in some ways than what we've done on the street as law enforcement. So I give you guys kudos and mad respect for what you do.
And that's why you're on the show. Thank you very much. We don't usually get that, especially from an accomplished person like yourself. So obviously we appreciate that. That humbles us. Okay, so before we go to a break, I just want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. We're going to kind of dive into how a person would feel if they were put in that position where they had to work next to each other. Social service working with police working with social services, and just try to have an objective thought. Some of the questions may be biased at some point because obviously we're coming from that perspective. But ultimately, it's going to be balanced with other biased questions from the other perspective. And then basically, we're just going to have a nice discussion, see where it goes. I don't think we're here to point a pro or point to, I prefer this over that. It's just more, let's put some stuff out there, see if people are really thinking it through. And then the dialogue comes from the comments. If people decide to join in on the discussion, we would love to hear what you have. And maybe if it goes out well, we could do it again. Just with more information. All right, guys, if you have it, the show Tier Talks for you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor. When we come back, let's talk about social workers and police working together. All right, so right off the bat, obviously this is related to the new look at law enforcement, right? Basically trying to bring about a gentler side to what police do, which I just say any law enforcement profession. I mean, use of force is never pretty. And I think the people that try to implement this software perspective are people that really don't understand why use of force is needed. And obviously now we're at a point where they have a voice. And now, ideas are coming across the table, which includes this, sitting social workers next to police, trying to see if they can cover the de-escalation technique with just, if need be, use of force. So there's a lot of questions we have to cover here, but just right off the bat, and I'll start with Cody first, and then we'll go to Connie, and then we'll kind of play it back and forth like that. But for me, I think cops are trained at de-escalation. I think that use of force already, to me, is a last resort. That's to my opinion. I think there's a lot of officers that, use of force shouldn't be something we want to go into doing, but sometimes we're forced to. My concern is going to be, is this at that point where use of force should be employed, but we're trying to go that extra effort to de-escalate? And does that put parties at risk? Or why do we feel that officers aren't doing enough when it comes to de-escalation? So Cody, do you mind attacking that first?
I'll try my best to answer that. I think that, as you said, the use of force is never pretty. And understanding where our training comes from and what they call muscle memory, which comes from repetitive training and learning skills, both physical and mental, to respond to situations that require use of force, is very difficult from a civilian perspective to understand. Just like a civilian wouldn't understand going out in the field and watching what the military does in a war zone. I mean, fundamentally, they get it. They're in a war zone, but to actually see that could be very offensive. They aren't desensitized to that, and they may not understand the steps and why we get to the point where in the de-escalation process that we step above that and start to use force in order to take somebody into custody or to get them to be compliant or to stop a deadly situation. And to understand that Article 35 of the use of force also includes serious physical injury, meaning that as a police officer, if I'm dealing with somebody on the street who's perpetrating a crime that could cause serious physical injury to myself or someone else, or even be injurious to themselves, I have this duty, I have this response to go and try to eliminate that chance of serious physical injury. So it isn't just a life or death situation. And often when you hear people talking about use of force within the community, they're talking about witnessing a police officer doing something to somebody who's unarmed. And I implore people to keep in mind that being unarmed without physically holding a weapon doesn't mean that person can't cause serious physical harm or even death to another. If you think about it from the perspective where you have a small police officer, maybe it's a female, maybe it's a slight male, he's thin, shorter, and he responds to a football player who's 6'4" and 350 pounds, he's a linebacker, and becomes assaultive with that police officer. Does that linebacker need to have a gun or a knife or a baseball bat in order to cause serious injury, harm, or death to that police officer or somebody they're fighting with? Absolutely not. They can do that with their brute force, their physical force, their bare hands. So I think that it's difficult sometimes to have the conversations with the civilian population that's expecting us to integrate with social workers to resolve use of force where they see us as militant and over the top. I think it's difficult to have that conversation until there is a clear and concise understanding of what our objective is and why we have to do what we do. I'm not saying that the confines that we work in cannot change and that they shouldn't change. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying that it does need to be understood. And one of the ways to make that understood is to have news media, mainstream media, change their narrative about how they talk about what's going on and to have an honest dialogue and narrative about what we do in law enforcement. And that includes within the corrections realms, not just the street cop, what all of us must do in order to maintain a safe environment. And it's very complex and it's very static.
Well, that's part of the reason why it's good to have this discussion, because the funny thing is I think that we've in corrections have usually dealt with community policing technically. When there's a concern in the prison, it's not just going to be custody that sometimes gets involved. You're going to have mental health. You're going to have whatever resources are immediately there on the scene to help. But ultimately, custody does take control. If they feel that the de-escalation technique is not working, they will tell like mental health or whoever, say, you got to step aside. We have to resolve this issue. And there is a level of authority that's given back to custody. But again, there's still 100% effort to try to de-escalate by bringing in those parties who are better suited. But there's also a good working relationship between them both where they kind of understand this is my role up to this point. Now, my concern is if this starts to affect the outside, could that change the inside? But Connie, you working as a medical provider, obviously also represent the civilian side of things. You could see that corrections has kind of had this community policing thing for a while. And we kind of have an understanding of, when it's time for us to play our role and when it's time for, let's say, custody or, back to myself, custody. So let's say when it's time for civilians to play their role and when it's time for custody to play their role. But if there's no authority, if there's no leadership, because the role could be ambiguous at times, do you actually see that there could be a conflict between people like that's in law enforcement now, trying to resolve an issue their way, and then you have someone that's trying to de-escalate, maybe the social service provider, the social worker, trying to do it their way, and just having that conflict because it could go either way.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we talk about as it relates to role ambiguity is part of the frustration of people not necessarily knowing clearly what their role is in a situation. And I could kind of see that as we begin to integrate, if this is what's happening, integrating social workers in law enforcement, that there may be some times where people are sort of not certain who's in control at the time. So if the social worker is being brought on board to de-escalate, understandably, I feel that, law enforcement has been trained. And so it has to be really clear what the role is and where does that line get drawn? Where is the social worker supposed to step out, and where is law enforcement sort of regaining control or taking control back from that situation? I think one thing that this does highlight is the need for some cross-functional training. I think that it is clear that social workers will need to understand what it is that officers are trained to do, how they operate. And I think that law enforcement will also need to understand, so what is the scope of the social worker? How do they de-escalate? How do they actually manage this human behavior and human development and all these other things that come into play as they're de-escalating? I would assume that the social worker would be seen as the mental health professional on the scene. And so certainly there would have to be some, I think, clear delineation of who does what at what point in time. And, does the social worker have the authority to say, okay, give me 5 more minutes? Or is it a matter of, the officer who's going to say, because they have control of the situation in the moment, does the officer get to say, no, the time is up, we're going to move to the next level in order to contain the situation? So I think this is a great conversation because it's clear that there is no clear path to really getting there.
I would like to say one thing too. Something I learned from corrections is that even though there may be authority present on the scene, I like to think obviously custody is that authority level. It doesn't really have to be exercised because we know each other well. We know our roles so well that we don't even have to exercise on even novel situations because we just automatically react because, again, that's the development of that relationship that we have with the working professionals. Because I would like to think, as I said, most of the time when we go onto a scene, I want to de-escalate. Especially when I became a supervisor. You have no idea how much I appreciate those that can communicate. A skill I may not have recognized as a regular officer, but definitely a skill as you recognize as a supervisor because of the lives that you're responsible for. But maybe I'll go to Cody now. Is one of the things that I like that you touched on is it isolated, the goals? So what I mean by that is, okay, so if I'm coming in with the mindset that, I'm a police officer custody, I want to use force, I want to resolve this as quick as possible because I don't want the suspect to have all that time to think and maneuver, where maybe from the social work side, they want longer time because maybe that's where their greatest success is. And at the end of the day, if it goes to a use of force situation, will the social service provider think or social service worker think that they failed at some level? Because, maybe that they consider it as an isolated goal, or God forbid, let's say law enforcement, doesn't have to use that use of force. Will they get upset because, they figure, well, this person, went too far with it and our life could have been at risk. So, is there a conflict if the goals are extreme where one is to de-escalate and one is just to let's get done and let's secure the scene? So, I mean, what's your thoughts on that? I'm throwing a lot at you, Cody, but maybe you could piece it together for me.
I got a couple things that come into play with that. First of all, one of the things I want to point out that just for people on the outside who are not in law enforcement to think about, in corrections, as you guys talk about, you have this team that's integrated between a custody team and the medical aspect or the social work aspect that comes in. And even within the confines of a prison system, the corrections officer is learning good communication, effective communication skills, because you're dealing with a dynamic of people where you need that, and you need to have, you need to enforce rules and have respect. And I think that it's a narrower scope in one aspect that makes the integrate as a really good team. On the street, on the other hand, you have the static situation where a person is free. They're not in the confines of a yard or a prison cell or a cafeteria. They are in, wherever they are. They have access to cars, to weapons, to other human beings that they could take, into, basically kidnap or do whatever. There's so many variables that come in that it's hard to define where that line comes in between law enforcement and justified use of force and social workers coming in to try to de-escalate. And I think that it's really important to understand that, yeah, law enforcement are supposed to de-escalate, of course, but that we certainly have all, I believe, worked with somebody on the street that is absolutely incapable of that. Some people do not have the personality. They do not have the communication skills. They have a militant, absolute way of looking at things where they are a 100% authoritarian. And that does not work in de-escalation. It also does not work when you see countless videos of law enforcement responding to a scene where you have somebody who's potentially violent and they should be de-escalated and maybe are having a mental health breakdown, and you have 5, 6, 10, 13 cops all screaming something different. One's telling them to put their hands up. The other one's telling them not to move. Somebody's telling them to get on the ground. Somebody's telling them to drop a knife or a gun or whatever it is. And you are bombarding this person who's having a mental breakdown and has an adrenaline dump with multiple things that are now starting to agitate them. Yet you think you're de-escalating it. So I think when we talk about de-escalation coming from a law enforcement perspective, whether it's dealing with the mental health aspect or dealing with use of force, it's very imperative that American law enforcement has further training in order to understand what the scope of de-escalation is. And that would give them respect for the social workers that they work with and allow that social worker to do their job, and also an ability to have a better skill set for themselves. And I know I'm going to hear slack from this from the law enforcement community, because many, even people on the other talk show I've been on, feel that law enforcement shouldn't have to be trained as social workers. Okay, you might not have to be trained as a social worker, but you should have good, effective communication skills and the ability to deflect and listen to what somebody's saying and de-escalate them through your verbiage that you give back to them. Sometimes it's as simple as saying to somebody who's having a mental fit, and I learned this from an old schooler when I was very young in law enforcement, and I used it many times, is to say to somebody, I can see you're really frustrated and you're having a bad day. I bet you haven't taken care of yourself today. You're probably thirsty. Can I get you a bottle of water? And all of a sudden you'll see the person like just completely change their facial expression and go, oh yeah, I'm thirsty. Well, you just opened up a dialogue with them that took them out of the mental loop they're in of having a breakdown, with as simple as something as saying, hey, do you want a sip of water? Learning effective communication skills that are sometimes outside the box is a difficult thing for law enforcement, because we have muscle memory training. We have pride. We are told we are supposed to be militant. We are supposed to have a strong command presence. And of course, you need those things to be safe, but it doesn't mean you can't integrate more things into the toolbox.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple of things to what you said real quick. Great dialogue, by the way. So one thing with corrections is we're not as well equipped as I would like to think we should be. So we are forced to communicate.
Yes.
And that becomes our main tool to get out of a lot of situations. We don't have anything directly to go to gain some level of authority. A lot of us, we have to communicate. Also, I love what you mentioned about the chaos and, how a person that's going through something traumatic, maybe getting orders from all these different, people, just not having that same level of consistency that they need to calm the situation down. One thing in corrections that we're lucky with is that a supervisor is always going to be on scene almost immediately. And once they come on scene, the highest level supervisor there then takes control. So now there could be that level of consistency with that supervisor, as long as they have the respect from their subordinates. So hopefully at that point, that level of consistency helps deal with the chaos that obviously, if there's no consistency, would obviously happen. But Connie, in regards to some of the stuff that Cody was mentioning, I do agree that some law enforcement officers, some police, may not like how the title of social worker being put into their title, if you will. Like if you told someone, hey, you're being trained on de-escalation techniques, they may be a lot more willing than someone saying, hey, you're being trained to be more like a social worker. Because for some reason, even in corrections, and it's sad to say, even though we're all working technically on the same mission, a lot of people see, well, in corrections anyway, I don't know if it'll be the same in the streets, but their job is to advocate for the population. And when you have an us versus them mentality, anybody that stands to advocate for the inmate population becomes the enemy to the custodial side of things. Or I don't know if it would be the same way, because right now we have a divide with the community and with the police, that a social worker could be seen as an advocate. I'm not having a partner for me. I have someone that's going to try to micromanage me. So is this person going to help me, or are they going to advocate and pretty much judge everything I'm doing? So that view of the person next to you, I'll give you another thing real quick. If me in leadership, I don't like fostering the us versus them mentality, because it does create a negative perspective on the people that have a role that they're meant to advocate. But it doesn't mean we're enemies, because I shouldn't technically be enemies with the inmate population either. It's a working relationship. When a few people act foolish, we do what we got to do. But for the most part, the us versus them mentality really does affect the working environment, because there are roles where you do have people that will have to advocate. That is your job. So, Connie, could you see that play out if we have this us versus them mentality, let's say police versus the community, and now you're sitting me as a police officer next to someone who's a social service worker, who's really only being there because they're saying, well, I haven't been doing my job effectively. Technically, that's why how this position's being brought into the pictures, because there's a failure from us to be effective. We're over aggressive. We're seen as Neanderthals. I mean, are we already starting at in a bad way?
I mean, it feels like we're starting off on the wrong foot, but I feel our reality is that we've got to be reminded that we have one mission, right? This is not about my title. This is not about your title. Our mission is, so if it's all about law and order, and it's about the best way to gain compliance without us having people get hurt in the end, whether it's the officer or it's the person who's non-compliant in the moment. And if that means to bring someone on who can help where you may have, you may need the additional support, then there's nothing wrong with, I think, bringing in a social worker that's going to be able to be your anchor, right? I don't think that this is us creating a situation where someone has leverage over another. I think it's professionally immature to take it in a way that, oh, this person is going to try to micromanage me, or this person is here to, tell me what to do or teach me how to do my job. That's not it at all. If we remember what the mission is, I think it's okay to have someone in who might be more effective at this particular thing. This doesn't do anything. This says nothing negative about how you perform as an officer. It says nothing negative about all the goodness that you've done throughout your career. It's just saying at this point in time in our system, we need to look at other ways in order for us to have better relationships with the community. We also want to make sure that we are not out there creating situations where we have these riots and we have this unrest that's going on. And so this is almost just the response to say, here's how we think we could help everyone to do this job better. Here's the support we're going to give you to help pick up the slack in some area, and I feel like the reminder of the one mission also eliminates that divide, right? Why does it have to be us and them? The reminder of the mission says, so this is what we're trying to accomplish together. This is our mission. And with that mission being something we have in common, we're going to work together to get there. That means if I'm me as a social worker, I'm unable to de-escalate, I should also know when it's time to say, hey, officer so-and-so, this is beyond my scope, right? Like, yes, you're going to try all the skills and tools and all the stuff that you have, but I feel like there is that partnership. There is a necessary collaboration that's going to happen if this integration is going to work. And I think the resistance kind of will make it seem as though we don't want to do better. And I don't think that that's where officers are. I don't think any officer goes out thinking, I'm going to end up on the front page of the paper today, right? No one wants that. If this social worker is going to help me get home safely to my family every night, then by all means have the social worker with me. But, I know it's a tough thing because it's a shift from the way law enforcement has operated, I think, traditionally. And so it may take some time for us to get there, but that doesn't mean we can't get there.
Yeah, and I actually think it's considered, or it could be a resource. It's just the way the resource was introduced. It's introduced on something that is negative, and instead of them promoting the fact that this could be a good working relationship that has benefits for both sides, it's not. It's introduced as, we need this now because of how law enforcement is with the public, and we need someone to monitor them. So it kind of feels like the introduction of it is
it's force fed.
Yeah. For some reason, my words are a little lost today, but yeah, 100%. It feels like you're pushing something. So obviously, if you're pushing, that means what am I accepting with it? I'm not accepting the fact that it's a resource. I'm accepting the fact that I'm a fuck up. Excuse my language, but my words someday are lost for some reason. But I'm a fuck up. So by me accepting this relationship, what am I saying about myself? So I think I like how we're mentioning it here. Like both you and Cody hit it spot on. Is that it should be seen as a resource, but again, how it was introduced makes us resistant to it because we're seeing it as a challenge to our authority, a challenge to who we are and the way things have been done in the past. I mean, does that make any sense, Cody?
Absolutely. I think, it's almost, it's like saying you're inadequate. You come and do this job and give your all, but you suck at it. And so now we're going to have somebody else come in and help you do your job. And it's like being force fed, I think, is where you're kind of going with it. And, it falls right in line with one of the things I talked about on your previous shows. What you gave me the privilege of coming on and talking about PTSD, right? And I don't mean to bring that up on this show, but it falls right in line with that human mentality of, oh, I'm fine. Oh, nothing's wrong with me. Oh, I don't need a counselor. I don't have PTSD. I don't have this wrong. Well, when you're talking about mental health in society, whether it's drug addiction, depression, PTSD, whatever it is, it's very hard for somebody who's in crisis to reach out and get help, whether it's civilian or law enforcement alike. Then you're talking about bringing people in who are trained to help deal with these situations. And most of them have a specialty and a modality that they do. So now you're talking, oh, let's step away from your addiction training. Let's step away from your PTSD training. And let's have you go out in the street and integrate everything you know across a broad spectrum of people with issues and help de-escalate and cut down the violence that law enforcement encounters dealing with these people who have a broad spectrum of mental health issues. It's going to boil down to, I believe, whether it's in law enforcement or the military or in any environment where we come into people with mental health issues, that it's going to have to be very, very specific integrated training where you go and you do scenario-based training alongside the team of people you're going to be working with who are social workers or mental health crisis workers or whatever the definition you're going to be using, psychologists, psychiatrists, and going in and having that verbiage practice through your mind so you have a muscle memory of what it's like to interact with this person in a situation. To have reality-based training and things where you go in and you really see what that feels like, and making sure that the people that we work with out there are our team members and not feeling like you're losing your authority and not feeling like they're losing theirs either, because on some extent they're an expert in their field. So it's about integration.
Right. And it's sad right now that we live in a world that operates on extremes, because here's the funny thing. So we implement this new resource. Let's say we have social workers coming in, and I'm going to call them resource. I'm going to be fair. Let's have an objective dialogue here. I want to be fair. I don't want to have a negative bias. So because we operate on extremes, it's like, okay, well, the social worker's here to protect the suspect or the person going through the breakdown, whatever it is. Or is the social worker here to protect the officer? Because maybe they can notice signs and they're able to de-escalate that suspect or that, person going through something from acting out aggressively. Or the thought that nobody wants to have is maybe they're doing both at the same time. And the question to me is, and Connie mentioned it before, is that you're dealing with a lot of situations that are ambiguous, a lot of different types of training that, a sign that, a sign that this person provides me could mean something different than a sign that they're going to show to the officer. Same sign, but for me, I interpret it differently than the police officer, or the police officer interprets it differently than the social worker. So now all of a sudden it could be a position where, just an example, and I'll go with Connie first and Cody, is, we come onto the scene, we see this person as being aggressive. So let's say law enforcement comes on the scene, see this person as being aggressive. I put out my gun because I want to protect myself. I don't know what this person has. The social worker believes that the gun is aggressive, and now it's making it impossible for them to talk down the suspect. So they could be asking me to put the gun away. Connie, tough dialogue there, but can you see how, different backgrounds. Same. One more thing, real quick. So we're talking about training police officers to be kind of act like social workers, right? I don't like using that. Police officers to be better at communicating. Let's not use the word social worker, right? Let's just make them have enhanced communication, right? Now, the problem here is I think with the public, because they don't have faith in law enforcement, which obviously I think that lack of faith comes from a lack of understanding of what has to be done in this profession. And sometimes things that we do are not pretty. And this is what gave birth, that lack of understanding gave birth what could be a very receptive if it wasn't born by how it was born, how it was introduced, right? So now, even if I had officers trained to be like social workers, granted, it is what it is, they still wouldn't be trusted. Because one thing is they're still the officers with that same mindset, that same default. And at the end of the day, you have to choose one role. Either you come to the scene to be a police officer, or either you come to the scene to be a social worker, or, because again, those are the extremes, or can you come to the scene and be both? Connie?
So, I mean, unless social workers are trained in law enforcement, it would be difficult to have an expectation of a social worker to show up and be both. The social worker is going to show up to be a social worker. They're going to show up to be in this therapeutic space, and they're going to employ all of the various tools and therapeutic practices that they've learned throughout their career, throughout the education, et cetera. And so I think acknowledging that there's more that they bring to the table than just being better at communicating can help take the edge off. They are not there just for the sake of communicating, but there's this understanding that the scope of their license allows them to deal with this wide array of personalities that you may encounter on the street, right? It gives them the tools that they need to kind of assess and figure out what is the best way to address this issue at hand. Now, I think that it's an unreasonable expectation to expect a police officer to function as a social worker. They are police officers. I think that there is training, like I'm thinking about Cody saying they're being able to go through scenario-based training. I think that those are the kind of trainings that will reinforce, here are ways that you should respond in these types of situations, which I think gives them some more to work with. So they may not be the best at communicating in a certain way, but if presented with these scenarios, their brain has now been exposed to these type of things happening, and here are the different paths they can take in order to de-escalate the situation. So I think understanding that the role of the social worker, they're not going to be able to step into the role of what a police officer is going to do. I think there will be an awareness of what the police officers' protocols may be, or maybe what the policies or procedures are. And so with that awareness, they may know it's time for me to back away, because usually at this point in a scenario, this is when law enforcement comes in, right? So I think there isn't this ability to wear two hats. I think there's just the ability to have a general understanding of what both people are there on the scene to do, and the way they will kind of respect each other's roles and back off where needed.
Yeah, that you definitely had a lot of great points there, because when you touched on basically the roles, social services coming on the scene to provide this, law enforcement coming on the scene to provide this, I see two things, and I'll have Cody maybe help me out with this. I see one that's reactionary and one that's preventive. I think the reactionary is just, let's get it done. And I would push that more to the police side of things. Again, nothing's 100%, but just bear with me on this just to get a thought out. And then I would push the longer measure, the preventive measure, which usually the longer measure is the fact that, that would probably be the social service worker, trying to prevent the person from harming themselves, where the police may be coming in. Yes, don't get me wrong. I don't want this person to harm themselves, but I also don't want them to harm me or the social worker. So I think the social worker may be very focused on the individual and not really so focused on the environment, but just focused on the individual, where the police officer is going to be focused on everything, including the threat that the social service now, maybe like they could be taken as a hostage. I mean, who knows? So the officers coming in, looking at the environment as a whole, where the social service provider may be coming in just focusing on what's directly in front of them. I guess the reaction versus the preventive. I don't know. I know I'm making sense because thank God you're nodding, because I'll keep on rambling until I get a nod from somebody. But can you help me out here? Because this is, again, I'm just tough night.
I think that it's important to, I'm going to change the dialogue a little bit just about this to make a point. So let's think about people and officers. I mean, to some extent, law enforcement officers can have an ego, an issue. They're a command presence. They're in a position of authority. Let's think about changing the term of social worker and switch it up to hostage negotiation. If you have a police officer that ends up becoming a sergeant or an investigator and they go to hostage negotiation school, all of a sudden they're talking about a dialogue that they open up with this person that has a hostage, and they're trying to change the outcome and circumstance that's currently happening to get that person, that perpetrator of that crime, to stop doing what they're doing, right? What's the difference between having a hostage negotiation training and instead of it being hostage negotiation, have it be mental health training? There is no difference. It's still about the dialogue and how you're dealing with the perpetrator of criminal behavior or violent behavior. Even if they're not a criminal, maybe they're just having a mental health breakdown. It has nothing to do with crime. So I guess that was the wrong word to use. I should just say somebody who's going through crisis. So I think that the word social worker automatically makes law enforcement put up this wall and say, no, not happening. Let's not think about that. Let's think about we're dealing with how you train to talk to people. And it's not like you have to go off and get a master's in social work or a bachelor's in psychology or a 2-year degree in anything. All we're talking about is for you, the many hats that you wear is for you to be willing to learn about talking in a dialogue that helps people in crisis. You don't have to be a social worker to do that. You have to be a caring, compassionate, professional human being. It's really that simple. So I think it's important, when you think about larger municipal PDs and city PDs that are big enough to have the budget to have a pastor or chaplain on the ranks who go and do ride-alongs with officers and help communicate with people in the community, help bring social welfare programs to people who live in lower income areas that need some help. That's all about communication, right? Why there's no reason that as a police officer, you're a brilliantly trained individual out there doing a very complex job, to train on one more aspect of communication in a way you may not have thought about fundamentally on your own, is great. Some people have a gift for it and some people do not. Some people have a gift for something else. Maybe that's why they're on the SWAT team, because they're better at like going in and kicking doors and taking numbers, So I think that I'm not trying to disagree with you, Connie. So I just want to say that I just think that I'm playing devil's advocate here, that the two hats thing, I think it's important to use terminology with that does make two hats accessible and isn't offensive to anybody doing their job. So maybe it's not about hiring a social worker to come in and do half our job for us. Maybe it's about training us to do a better job at our job.
Let me add something, because I actually, this is great, because it's actually opened up another dialogue. I just want to play devil's advocate to you now, Cody,
Okay.
because you touched on something right now. No, but this is great. But do you think it becomes complicated when you're on that scene and the hats get mixed? Like, how do I know when it's time for me to play this, or how do I know when it's time for me to play that? The reason why I'm bringing it up, just if I may real quick, is I remember working, visiting a facility out in Indiana in Clark County when they were doing 60 days in, and they were very understaffed. And they had officers who also had to be their medical response team. They were trained as EMTs. And when a code happened, they had to quickly shift gears. And sometimes they're like, hey, it gets confusing, Gangi, because I'm an officer, I'm ready to respond, but then I'm quickly being the medical person telling, hey, hold on, guys, we got to do this, we got to do that. So I'm asking, at any point, how do you blend them into one? What I'm saying, like, am I walking in with the idea that I'm either playing either or am I walking in with the and? I'm both.
I think it's and, because you think about a police officer. Okay, we didn't have tasers 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Now you have a taser. Originally they had the PR-24 nightstick. Then they went to the ASP baton. It's things integrate and change all the time, whether it's the tools on your belt or the tools in your brain. Your biggest tool as a law enforcement officer, no matter what part of law enforcement you work in, is your noggin, your head, your brain, your ability to communicate. So learning to have more tools in your belt, learning some communication skills that help tap into somebody's mental crisis and de-escalate and calm them down, does not mean you can't take care of business. That does not mean you can't turn on, I got to go kick somebody's tail. I got to get this person cuffed and stuffed. I got to get this person under control. I got to get, people safe, or maybe even have to take a life. You still have your elevation of force, right? If you're doing all the de-escalation stuff and you have the ability to do that very well and a finite ability to do it, and that's not working, you're going to escalate through your use of force just like as if you'd never been trained on those de-escalation facts. The factors of the de-escalation is just a tool to help you hopefully avoid those steps in use of force for a longer period of time and have a better chance of having a better rapport and helping somebody in the community that is in mental crisis and needs help, and to allow the communities to see us as somebody who's beneficial instead of somebody who's combative and violent. Because the perception, whether it's true or not, that is the perception. We're seen as militant, oppressive, violent, violating people's rights. That's not conductive and conducive to society or our careers. I mean, that's not helping anybody, whether it's portrayed by mainstream media and as a bunch of bull crap, or it actually is the fact, And many of us have worked with an officer who's an abusive moron and needs to be there, have their butt kicked out of law enforcement. Unfortunately, there's bad apples in every career. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is, and they need to be eliminated. And we need to have a voice to eliminate them, because it only makes life harder for those of us who go out and do our job with integrity and care about it and do it well. So I think having two hats doesn't necessarily take away from one or the other. It benefits us as a whole.
And you know what's great, by the way, and we're the ones that advocate for that officer to get out. When we see an officer that's making us look bad, we push for that officer to get out. Let me ask the question. I'll go with Connie first, talking about, we'll start getting to a close now. I just have a few more questions, and this is not going to be an easy one either. I'm getting the questions as they come along by listening to what you guys are saying. Going back to the two hats and talking about the outcome, would it be better to have police trained, I hate saying the word as social workers, but just bear with me, because that's not what I mean, but just to keep the discussion where it is. Police trained to be social workers, or social workers to be trained as police? Is there a difference in what that foundation is first? Like if I'm a police officer being trained as a social worker, the foundation I have, as opposed to a social worker being trained as a police officer, the foundation. Do you see that there's a difference, or are we trying to find a middle? Connie?
I think we're trying to find a middle. I mean, because if you think of, a homeless person on the street who's causing a disturbance, or you think of someone who's an alcoholic, or you think of someone who's a substance abuser, when, officers respond to those populations, I would have to assume that there has been some training on how to deal with these different situations, this type of person who might be combative, that they're drunk. Like there's a way, I believe, that they would be trained. And I don't think that's any different when you're training them to be able to respond to someone who is mentally decompensating. I feel like if there are specialized trainings that they're going to receive, that they've received them. And maybe we may need to increase the frequency so that those are skills they can easily pull on if they need it. I think with social workers, it may be a little more challenging to have them shift from social work to the law enforcement sort of mindset. I mean, earlier on, I don't remember if it was you or Cody who mentioned it, but you talk about, the social worker coming on the scene and kind of focusing on the individual, whereas the officer comes on the scene and he's looking at it more holistically. He's observing everything in that scene. So I do feel like there's a way that as a law enforcement person, there's a specialized training, or there's a certain way you just see the world, or you see the environment when you come into a particular event. Whereas I think the training that a social worker would need it in order to have the, law enforcement sensitivities or sensibilities, like it may be more of an uphill battle. I'm not trying to underestimate anyone's qualifications, but what I'm saying is there's an entire academy training that officers go to in order to be prepared for the work that they're going to do. And I don't know that, I mean, unless that is the plan, that social workers would go through that same training in order to kind of be able to function in that manner if need be. But, you know, I don't know that there's really a clean answer to that one.
Well, as we're having this discussion, I think when police come on the scene, I do like to think they tone it down. That's what they're supposed to do. They're trying to de-escalate, but they're ready to escalate if need be. They're ready. It's in the backbone. So I think maybe it's harder to set your mind to be ready to take it up as it is to tone things down. You know what I mean? I think because at any time law enforcement may have to take it up a notch. So, yes, we're going to de-escalate. We're going to do what we got to do. But at any time, don't get me wrong, we're ready for that automatic, need to, God forbid, if we have to take a life, we have to take a life in an effort to protect and serve. But for the social workers, again, I don't want to generalize, just hear me out. It could be just, I'm going to tone it down and may not be ready to have to take that initiative to take that life, because it could be against everything because don't forget too, I don't think police officers look at taking life as a win. I don't think no one comes on the scene wanting to do that. How they justify it is, I had to take the life to save others. That's a justification, which to them they can live with because they're able to justify that the life was taken because a greater good had to be served. They're not going to see that as a failure. Where I think the social service provider may see that if they have to take that life, that could be a failure. Even if it is to protect others, it still could be a failure because what they're born to do, what they've been trained to do. Where we're more trained to, as I said, react, they're more trained to maybe prevent and tone it down. So I think that could play out on how quick they are to react. So again, where do I think the greater foundation would be? I definitely think if we could train our officers a little more in gifts that they already should technically have already. But that foundation that need to have to do that hard choice, that's not something that, it's very hard to do. I don't think that's something that you either can do it or you can't do it. Even I would like to say, and you can realize that even not everybody that becomes law enforcement can actually do it either, guys. It's a very difficult choice. But what's your thoughts on what I just said, Cody? Does that make any sense?
It totally makes sense to me. And it also plays into the fact that if you have social workers come in and get dually trained as law enforcement, and that's not really something they're impassioned about, it's not really what they want to do. And they don't feel comfortable with the potential to use force or end somebody's life. They also become a liability for other law enforcement in the area and a liability for the municipality that hired them, because now if they hesitate, that hesitation could cost them their lives or somebody else their lives. So I think it's very important to have clear confines of what the expectations is of the people that are coming in to deal with a mental health crisis, and what hat do they wear? Are they a law enforcement officer? Are they crisis management, social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist? Are they counselor? What are they doing and what is their role? And everybody has to be clear and concise and comfortable with that, including the person in that role. So I think that's something, you're going to look at a lot of changes in policy and procedure, SOPs, and, there's a lot of things to come down to the pike, a lot of research and a lot of training on both sides of the fence.
Right. And the foundation for the priority of the hat literally is the foundation of what you started off with.
Yeah.
Whether I start off at this level. And before we go, one last question, something that me and Connie were discussing, I also think me and Cody discussed in a while too, is the position of authority. So real quick, as I said, in corrections at the very beginning of the dialogue, there's a working relationship that really allows an authority to exist without having to be exercised. It's just a courtesy amongst different departments that it really never gets challenged. We all know our perspective. And for some reason, I think people in corrections, they know when it's their role. It's not questioned. I believe it or not, these are professionals that, there's always going to be ambiguous moments, but for the most part, they know, oh, that's a custody thing. That's a cut, or oh, I'll give that to mental health, because we do it every day. It's not new to us. And we're able to kind of transition that very simple. Now in the streets could be some level of difficulty with that. Because it's not a norm. It's something that's being introduced, or maybe be introduced after the fact. So after we secure the suspect, now they go ahead and go through all those resources, where now we're trying to bring the resources onto the scene, which again, we've done in corrections, police may still be getting involved in that, or relatively new, because I'm sure in some places they have. And guys, I'm trying to avoid all stereotypes, but forgive me, because it's kind of a stereotype that started the dialogue, but obviously it's still it's a needed discussion. Now, with that said, when it comes to the position of authority, I know it's a matter of understanding each other's role. I got that. But would you say that ultimately, if this authority was to be shared, so if it's me working with a social worker, does the social worker have the authority to tell me not to pull out a gun? Do I have the authority to tell the social worker to stop what they're doing? I mean, where are we at with that, Cody? Do you know, or what would you want expected out of that?
I would think that as a law enforcement officer who is trained to deal with use of force and sees the continuance of the potential for violence or serious physical injury or death of myself, the social worker, or somebody else in the environment, that officer has the right to basically establish at what point the social worker is done. And the social workers are going to have to be clear and concise about what their role is and not have an ego issue where they feel like their authority is being taken away or their position or potential. There comes a time and a place where use of force is justified and necessary and is the only option left. And so through training and lots of discussion and education, that would have to come to, be something that's very established for the roles of both people or the one person who wears a hat, whichever it is. So it's complex and we're on a learning curve right now, and there is no clear definitive answer of how the trajectory of law enforcement is going to go in a way that's going to appease society and make society also feel safe and make law enforcement safe for the officers that are in it. It's there's a lot of factors on the table and a lot of people who are angry and dissatisfied right now. And, at some point, an honest conversation has to transpire with all parties involved to start to make that change. And that can't happen when people are so angry they can't talk and they can't have a dialogue that brings, some compromise and understanding of where we're going with all this.
All right, Connie. So I just want to know if you could help me out too with the question I asked Cody. I think it's that position of authority. It's going to matter. I think that's where the big argument is. And again, I think that we have a level of partnership with our people in corrections, but I'm wondering how that would play out. Just out of curiosity, do you think that if one side's given authority over the other, which side should it be, or if they can work truly as partners?
Well, I mean, I do think that there is specialized training that law enforcement has that would default to them as having the command of the scene. They do have a higher level of training, in my opinion, than a social worker would have in that situation. And so I do believe that they would be the ones to have the control of the scene. Now, I know that it can get sticky if the social worker is feeling like I just need 2 more minutes and the officer feels that it's time to kind of cut all the conversation. But I also feel that, as they get to work with each other and learn each other's style of working and learn each other's capabilities and such, that it opens the door for more trusting, I think, collaborative efforts in de-escalating situations and really working as partners.
Right. And the reason why I thought it was great to have this dialogue before I get you guys closing thoughts is because people have to understand that there's a perspective there. At the end of the day, even with the multiple perspectives we have here, we're talking about the preservation of life, which may not always be about the person you're responding to the scene for. It could be what's around them or the people that are responding to the scene, which would include the officer and the social worker. And the sad thing is, I feel like that got lost today. Just in general, not with us in our dialogue, but just in general with the community, that we're expendable. An officer comes to a scene, they're expendable, and that you have to exhaust the escalation techniques. But all of us here just decided, yes, that's great, but believe it or not, even though it wasn't said specifically, it was there. Preservation of life is first, but the preservation of life for the people that come on the scene to try to do the right thing, to try to, ease whatever this person is going through. But at the end of the day, the problem is the public, when they want to make this criminal justice reform, they may not trust that to go back to the hands of the officer. Like, we put a social worker next to you so they can take control. No. So we could be partnered, but they cannot take control, because at the end of the day, the need to save a life is what we do. It's what law enforcement does. And you can't, I mean, we'll work with you, but when we make that call that a life has to be taken, not that we want to do it, but if it has to be taken to protect others, we'll make that call. We are not expendable. But I think that's the part of the dialogue that I know the public right now is looking to revamp the system. And I think eventually what they could try to do is shift that authority over to that side. And I don't know, a lot of social workers won't want that authority, because they're not going to want to make the call to take a life. So before we start putting people in shoes that they don't want, or shoes that they can't fill, let's just get it out there why they can't fill it. And we really thought about it right now, especially when we asked that one question, which was the outcome. Do you want an officer to become a social worker, or do you want a social worker to become an officer? Yes, they have skill, but at the end of the day, it's the foundation that have to make that decision to take a life in an effort to protect the others. And I think that was very key for people to understand that. Cody, you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
I think I'd like to say in closing that it's important for the public to reestablish trust in the criminal justice system, not just in law enforcement, but even in a jury of your peers, and whether it's a grand jury or a jury for trial, and understand that police officers are accountable for what they do. We do have to answer to somebody, and to the people we work for, and to ourselves. And it's important to somehow rebuild and reestablish that trust. And when you're talking about a huge percentage of people in society that have mental health issues and are in crisis, I personally think it would be important to consider opening up institutions again, such as what they used to call an insane asylum. And I'm not talking about, harboring people there in an abusive manner, but getting people in and getting them help for their depression, their manic bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever they're going through, PTSD, whether that's through counseling or medication, and making sure that when they come back out and are integrated into society, they're safe. Right now, you're asking corrections officers and law enforcement officers to take on this dual role of social work and institutionalizing them and rehabilitating them and worrying about medications and the outcomes and life, preservation. It is a huge amount of responsibility. That being said, I do think law enforcement could take on a better role of de-escalation, a better role of learning how to talk to people. But it's important that society takes some responsibility for some of the things that are going on too, and to not go and start judging and becoming violent because mainstream media says something. That isn't the end all be all of truth. We know that it's not on many levels, whether it's politically or about law enforcement or about anything else, whether it's your country music star or your movie star. There's lies all the time in mainstream media because that sells what they need to sell. And society needs to take some accountability for giving time for the truth to come out.
Right. And before Connie says her closing thoughts, the key here was the priority of what needs to be done. So even when you have that training, you don't want to do it where it shifts the person's mindset to not even think about taking that measure that's need to take to save lives of others. So again, how do you balance that training? But again, I think the harder foundation to establish is the foundation of that law enforcement professional, and then maybe transforming that law enforcement professional into having those extra tools. But you can't give that to the other side when that's not something that's part of that foundation to take a life, when my whole life I'm here to preserve.
I think one of the things to keep in consideration with that is when you think about the European Union and Canada and how they deal with mental health, how law enforcement deals with mental health, even the fact that some law enforcement officers are unarmed. They have a very different approach to dealing with people within society and their mental health problems. And it's something that law enforcement in America might be able to learn some valuable lessons from, and use that in our foundation of being a police officer and changing how we integrate those skill sets with society when there's issues at hand.
Well said. And Connie, author Connie. Anything
for me, the only thing I wanted to say in closing is that there's a certain way that we just have to be less apt to jump to the worst possible conclusion. I think that if you've not walked in the shoes of a law enforcement officer, it's you can be on the sideline saying whatever you will, but you don't understand the pressures as well as all the other, I guess I would say, independent variables that would be impacting that officer's decision in the moment. And so as much as we may be disappointed or angry or upset about some of the outcomes we see, we almost never see all the things that led up to that escalation. And so we are making decisions based only on a snapshot of the event, of the situation. And we don't know how much effort the law enforcement officer has made to de-escalate. We don't know. And yes, there are bad apples everywhere. And so I'm not saying that we're excusing the bad apples. We do need to hold them accountable. But I also know that there are some law enforcement officers who are out there trying to do their best, who are trying to truly protect and serve, who are operating from a space of integrity. And it's unfortunate that they don't get the recognition of how difficult their job can be on any given day. And hopefully, you know, if this integration is actually happening, that it can be brought forward as a tool, as a resource, that way that there's actual buy-in, that they do have, you know, a voice at the table in this discussion, because it is impacting the job that they do from day to day.
Right. And guys, my closing thoughts are, I think what the concern is how the resource was introduced. As I mentioned before, I think that's very important to us. I think that a lot of us may become resistant just because if we accept it, what's it say about ourselves? So we introduced what could be a great tool at a very bad time. We introduced it when we were divisive, you know, which again, this could be a great tool to have, which most people will be welcoming. But if I welcome it, what does it say about me and how I do my job? And the resistance is not really necessarily resistant because I don't believe in the work that could accomplish. I just believe in what the work says about me. And it's not positive. You know, instead of introducing it as a way that could enhance, it's now becomes introduced as we're not doing our job and this has to be implemented. And again, without our input, you know, but as I said, if we're willing, this could be a great partnership as long as we set the standards. And yes, I do believe the level of authority has to go to the law enforcement professional because there's certain decisions that have to be made that come with that ability to adapt and adjust what should define someone as a law enforcement professional. Not saying that social work does not, but I'm talking about the adapt and adjust to take a life, to not have to hesitate to do that, you know, and not to look at yourself as a failure for doing that, because in the effort to save the many, you had to make that choice, and that's a choice you have to live with. Where I think from the other perspective, if you take a life, it could be seen as such, which again, I still hold a lot of respect for because you're still putting your life on the line to save that one individual. But again, we have the environment. So I think it was a great dialogue. Can't wait to see where it goes. But you like how we incorporated corrections in that. That was great. Thank you guys for doing that. As always, guys, the show is Tier Talk. Please don't forget, subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. The bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.